Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the foreign ties of Israel's illegal settlements.
The relationship between the United States, the occupation, and settlers runs deep.
As settler violence surges in the occupied West Bank, we look at the role U.S. citizens and other dual nationals play in Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
My name is Hind Hassan. I'm a journalist and international correspondent, and I report from all over the world, including the Middle East.
Earlier this year, Hind and a small team made their way to some of the occupied Palestinian territories, where they filmed a documentary for Al Jazeera's People and Power.
So what do you say to those in America who say that there should be more sanctions on even the funding of settlements by private U.S. residents?
I think that the people who claim that they support the Palestinians are not aware of the facts on the ground.
Hind was able to gain access to highly secured illegal settlements, where she spoke to several residents. Hind, it's good to have you here on The Take to talk about some of your latest reporting about illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. Many of these settlers are actually dual national citizens, and you met some of them in a settlement nestled in the hills of the Palestinian city of Hebron. Talk to me about getting into this settlement. What did it take? Because it's not easy.
No. So most of the settlements in the occupied West Bank have a lot of security. You can't just stroll up and go inside if you fancied it. You have to get permission or know somebody there. It can be very dangerous if you don't do that. And so the way that we managed to get into Ma'an Haver is through an Israeli-American tour guide who works in Hebron and in that area. And he took us there, and they were aware that he was arriving and that he was bringing us in. And so that's how we managed to get access to that particular settlement.
You said dangerous. So on the one hand, I'm thinking, okay, it sounds like a gated community, but dangerous why?
Well, it's dangerous because if you approach these settlements and you don't tell them that you are approaching, or they don't know who you are, and they might think that you're either a journalist or that you are a Palestinian, then they could be hostile towards you. And a lot of these settlements have surveillance equipment. So they use drones, they have cameras, they have their own militia patrolling it, and they are armed, of course, and you are not armed, so any form of confrontation could potentially escalate. So it is very important to be as safe as you can be when you are traveling around the occupied West Bank.
Okay, so you met someone there at this specific settlement, Ma'ale Haver, and it was an American man named Gideon, who has been living with his wife for about 11 years in that same settlement.
My wife has a cousin who lives here, and we would come from time to time for the holidays. And one day her husband took me outside and said, "You see this house next door? You can have it for 250,000 shekels, which was a pittance."
Talk to me about Gideon.
So he is an American-Israeli settler. And he's been living in that settlement, as you mentioned, for 11 years, but he's been in the occupied West Bank for much, much longer. He actually moved from the United States at the age of 14, and he calls it making Aliyah. So that means that you move from another country to Israel, and that is the process of basically obtaining citizenship and residency by moving to Israel.
The Jewish Agency of the State of Israel helps with the return to the land, a journey known as Aliyah. The agency works to...
It's very different to, other forms of immigration or obtaining passports. The reason why this is different is because you can only make Aliyah if you are either Jewish or the child of a Jewish person or the grandchild of a Jewish person. This is very specific to Jewish people who are not residents of Israel and who could apply and then travel to Israel and then live there as an Israeli citizen. Now, the controversy is as well that some people, when they travel to Israel, they then move to the occupied territories. So that is land that under international law is deemed illegally occupied by the state of Israel. And not just by international law, but also by the United States, by the United Kingdom. Many countries all over the world also say that settlements and settlement expansions in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal. So the person that we spoke to in our documentary is an example of somebody who has done that.
Historically, God promised Abraham, this is the land that is going to belong to you and to your children forevermore. Right here in my backyard.
He says that the land belongs to Jewish people and that it is his right as a Jewish person to be living there.
There's one moment where you mention it looks like a suburb. Can you describe it for me?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because when I saw it, I did think, like, this looks like something I've seen on TV when I'm watching a US show. And when some of my colleagues who are American saw it, they said exactly the same thing. It looked like a luxury suburban American community. I mean, the incredible views and the hills and, you know, the biblical mountains are a bit of a giveaway when you look beyond the settlement. But inside it, it's a little surreal. It just doesn't reflect the rest of the environment. And it's absolutely, completely different to the Palestinian communities and the Palestinian villages that we went to. Many of them are poor and they just don't have the same resources. They don't have the same security. So in that sense, it was very, very different to a lot of other parts of the occupied West Bank.
And Palestinians are not allowed to live there. You asked him about what it might be like to have a Palestinian neighbor. Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, I do. Because he said, look, people should be able to live wherever they want.
It's not illegal for me to raise my children here. I'm not bothering anybody else. This land never belonged to anybody else. It was always state land. We're going to decide what's best for us. We've established a state which is thriving, which is helping people all over the world. And nobody's going to tell us what we can do or what we can't do. I'm sorry.
So I asked him, what about Palestinians?
How would you feel about potentially having Palestinians live here?
This specific community is a small community and it wants to stay a small community. And we're also all religious Jews over here.
So not here, but in other places?
Yeah, in general.
So the main takeaway was, we don't want Palestinians living in this settlement.
Yeah, Palestinians can live here, just not here, not next to me. It seemed to be the sentiment.
Yeah.
The context in which Gideon is saying all of this is during what the UN says is a rise in settler violence against Palestinians throughout 2023, and especially since October 7th.
With the world's attention on Gaza and the humanitarian crisis there, violence has also erupted in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, some 50 miles away.
Settlers set fire to Palestinian property. Soldiers shoot tear gas at people trying to defend themselves.
This video shows Israeli settlers attacking Palestinian olive pickers and destroying their property, beating and chasing them from their fields.
Just days into Israel's war on Gaza, settlers here killed 6 Palestinians in 24 hours.
I know that you spoke to Palestinians as well. And I'm thinking in particular of one victim of settler violence, a man named Zakaria Al-Adra, who lives in a collection of Palestinian villages. Tell me about his story.
So, as you mentioned, there has been a lot of violence carried out by settlers against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank since October the 7th. There's been an unprecedented rise in violence. There really has been a significant amount of attacks that has been documented by rights organizations and cell phone videos of these attacks. Zakaria, he is a young man who is in his 20s, and not long after October the 7th, he was outside in his village when he was approached by a settler who was armed. There was an argument and there was some shouting, and then the settler shot him in the stomach. We know this because there is cell phone footage of that attack. It's horrific. You see him approach, you see the moment that he is shot, he falls to the ground, There's a lot of screaming and shouting. The settler runs away, and then Zakaria is dragged by other residents of the village. He's bleeding from his stomach. As a result of that attack, he was in hospital for weeks. He's a father. He has children. He wasn't able to see his children. He was very, very ill. It was a miracle that he survived, but his life has been completely changed.
He had a gun in his hand and was walking like this. He hit me with his gun here. He cocked his gun and shot me in this area. The bullet he shot me with wasn't a normal one. It was an explosive bullet. It suddenly exploded. It hit my lower chest and it exploded. There were 3 holes in my chest and 2 holes in my stomach. I put my hand on my stomach after he shot me. There was a 9-centimeter hole.
It's just a different reality to how the Israeli settlers live in the occupied West Bank.
The U.S. funding behind those settlements after the break. So, Hind, this aggression that you're talking about is the backdrop for this story, but there are layers to it. So in the film, there's a moment where you're near a settlement in the city of Hebron, and you're walking with an Israeli activist from the group Peace Now, and you're approached by soldiers who demand to see your IDs. And in the course of conversation, it turns out that one of them says he's from the U.S.
I need to see your ID, please.
You have authorization from the Israeli government to be here?
They know that we're here.
It's okay that you're telling me, but we need authorization.
Yeah, but I'm just, as well, just so you know.
Tell the guy here not to film us.
If they sent here terrorists from Al Jazeera, we have to make sure you're not.
Where's your accent from?
Michigan.
Michigan, okay.
Talk to me about that interaction, and what do we know about the U.S. citizens who are part of the Israeli army?
So actually, the location of where the interview was held was in Hebron City, and it was not too far from the home of a Palestinian activist who has been attacked and says he has been attacked numerous times. And so we were conducting an interview talking about how much influence the United States has in the occupied territories. And then suddenly we see soldiers approach us. That's not uncommon. It happens a lot when you're filming in the West Bank. When you are near to settlements, there are very often Israeli soldiers who will approach you. Where is your ID? They tell you to stop filming immediately. They can be very aggressive with you if you don't do what they say immediately. So we're always expecting to be stopped at some point. But what was different about this interaction was I noticed that his Israeli accent was also intertwined with an American accent. I could hear it quite clearly. And that appears in our documentary, but we actually continued having a conversation afterwards. And he was very open about the fact that he was American, and probably because that's not uncommon. It's not strange to bump into an Israeli in occupied territories who is a dual national, who is from the United States, who is from the United Kingdom. And of all the dual nationalities, we understand that there are more American Israelis than any other nationality. So, for example, in 2015, Oxford University released a report in which they said that they estimated around 60,000 settlers who live in the occupied West Bank are also American citizens. That was 9 years ago. It's now 2024. So 9 years ago, they came up with that figure. In the same report, they estimate there are around 400,000 settlers who live in the occupied West Bank. It's now thought that around 700,000 settlers live in the occupied West Bank. So it's likely that that 60,000 figure that we've seen there is much, much higher, because there are people who move to Israel with the sole intention of then going and moving into these occupied territories and being part of these settlements.
Well, and we know that these settlements have been in the headlines recently because of rising settler violence against Palestinians, but also because of U.S. sanctions against certain individual settlers who are accused of committing human rights abuses.
US President Joe Biden has issued an executive order imposing sanctions on Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank following a wave of violence.
The sanctions block the individuals from accessing all of US property, assets, and the American financial system.
This was the actual reason why we decided to do this documentary, because I noticed that people were reporting quite extensively on the rise of violence carried out against Palestinians. But it was the significant, unprecedented increase of that violence that led countries to show that they are taking some form of action. But there's a loophole there. And that loophole is that if you are carrying out any violent acts and you are a dual national and you hold a US passport, they can't impose those restrictions on you. So it's very unlikely that any visa restrictions will be imposed on an Israeli American. But if the United States is saying that settlements in the occupied West Bank and their expansion is illegal under their interpretation of the law, then there is another question, which is, what do you do about American citizens who are going and living in a place and therefore enforcing and helping to enforce an occupation that your country has deemed illegal? So far, it seems as though the answer is nothing. And what do you do about individuals who are potentially taking part in war crimes that are being carried out? That hasn't been tested yet, but that is definitely a question that is being raised more and more.
Well, on the one hand, these settlements are illegal according to international law. And then on the other hand, as we learned from your film, U.S. residents have funneled millions of tax-deductible donations. That's the part that really made me sit up and think. They funnel them into these illegal settlements. Can you explain how this works? How are they allowed to do that?
Very easily. So in the documentary, when we go to Ma'al Haver, I notice a sign as we go into the gate, and it says the One Israel Fund. And I say to David, who is the American Israeli tour guide, I ask him what the One Israel Fund is, and he tells us that it is an American organization and that it raises funds for settlements and it gives donations to settlements. So I then went and did a little research on the One Israel Fund. And what I discovered is that it is a US-based charity. It is officially listed as a non-profit governmental organization, which means that under Section 501 of the US Tax Code, anyone who donates to the One Israel Fund, their donations are tax deductible. They get a tax break for it. And so seemingly it appears to be in contradiction of what Biden is saying.
This is Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking at a press conference in Argentina in February of this year.
It's been long-standing U.S. policy under Republican and Democratic administrations alike that new settlements are counterproductive to reaching an enduring peace. They're also inconsistent with international law.
So Biden's administration say that these settlement expansions go against international law, yet here is the United States allowing organizations like the One Israel Fund to be able to receive donations that are then tax deductible. And we found a video from a few years back of a man who thanked the One Israel Fund for its donation of a drone. He's holding a drone and he's thanking them for the donation. And that individual has since been sanctioned by the United States for carrying out acts of violence against Palestinians.
Al Jazeera reached out to the One Israel Fund for comment for the film, but they didn't respond to repeated requests. So, Hind, you met several of these dual nationals, many Americans. Did they tell you why it was important for them to live on these settlements? So not just move to Israel and live in a place that is not deemed illegal under international US and UK law, but to move specifically to these settlements, which are?
I've met many settlers before. This wasn't the first time that I've spoken to them and tried to understand why they wanted to live in the occupied West Bank. And the reason is because they believe that the land belongs to them. They believe that the occupied West Bank belongs to Israel, to Jewish people. And so by moving to the occupied West Bank and living there, they are taking that land for Israel and for Jewish people. Every single settler that I've spoken to has told me that it is their God-given right to live in this location.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Fahrinisa Campana and Tamara Khandaker, with Ashish Malhotra, Chloe K. Lee, Sari Al-Khalili, Amy Walters, Khaled Soltan, David Enders, Sonia Abou-Gad, Zaina Badr, Catherine Newhan, Manahil Naveed, Tabish Talib, and me, Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.